Welcome, everyone, to our eighth session in this webinar series. It's Co-Creating the Future, and today's title is Global Challenges and Local Responses, Changes in the Global Business Environment and Their Impacts on Firm Strategy. And we have an expert faculty member with us today, Maggie Zhou, whom I will introduce momentarily. I'm Melanie Weaver Barnett, the Chief Executive Education Officer here at the Ross School of Business, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. We have people joining us from almost every continent, probably except Antarctica today. We have some of our alumni, we have our executive education and Ross School corporate partners, we have students, parents of students, and staff members from the university, and lots of other people. So welcome if you're joining us for the first time. And a special welcome to you, but many of you are repeat participants in our webinar series, and we're delighted to have you back. Very quickly, some housekeeping details. You're in listen only mode and the chat is disabled, but we want your questions and questions. So the Q&A is enabled. So enter your questions there. And if everyone will kind of monitor those questions, you can vote up the ones that you most want the answers to. So when Professor Zhou is finished with her presentation, we will ask as many of those most popular questions as we possibly can. If you have any technology issues, get out and get back in. You may, if you have low bandwidth, need to watch the session without video today. You probably will be able to see the slides and hear the audio, and later, if you want to, you will have access to the video. We'll send it out to you within a few days after this session, and it's also posted on our website in our online learning section on executive education. At the Michigan Ross School of Business, we're all about creating powerful ideas that are based in evidence, using those ideas to develop learning experiences that help people develop as purpose-driven leaders so that you and your organizations can have positive impact on the world. And that is why we are doing this webinar series during the time of the COVID pandemic to help keep you engaged and keep you learning and developing, even when it may be a little bit more difficult than normal to do so. So we're glad you're joining us today. Just so you know, in 2 weeks on September 30th at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time, we have a webinar called Leveraging Technology to Drive Value in Healthcare Management and Life Sciences. And that will be with 2 experts, one from academia and one from the business world. We'll have our Associate Dean for MBA programs, Brad Kalali, Professor Brad Kalali, and also Robin Washington, who was formerly the Executive Vice President and CFO at Gilead Sciences, and she's a board member at Alphabet, Salesforce.com, and she's a Ross Bachelor's of Business Administration, BBA alum. So we'll be delighted to have that session next week. We also have some deeper dives into online learning, and these are on our website. We hope you'll take a look, and you and some of your team members will join us for those. Starting October 5th, Becoming a Purpose-Driven Organization with Professor Bob Quinn, and starting October 12th, Growing and Developing Your Talent with Professor Dave Ulrich. Today, our expert, I'm delighted to introduce Maggie Zhou, Associate Professor of Strategy. Maggie's research is on the theory of the firm, competitive strategy, organization, structure, and institutions. Most recently, she's been investigating the role of complexity in setting limits to firm growth, competitive strategies, and organization design. Her work has been published in numerous academic journals, and she also is an expert instructor. She teaches here in our executive education programs and also in our MBA and PhD programs here at the Ross School of Business. She's a Ross alum. She earned her PhD in business economics from the University of Michigan. And when I stop sharing my screen momentarily and Maggie starts sharing hers, you're going to see the effect that COVID has on our hairdos here in Michigan. So I am going to I'm going to stop sharing, and Maggie will start sharing her presentation and take over. There, I can see you, Maggie. Go ahead and share your screen, and we'll get started with our presentation.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you for listening in today. So at Ross, I teach a course called Competing in the Global Business Environment. So today, for the next 30 minutes or so, I thought I would just share some of my thoughts about the global challenges and the local responses we see in the business environment. So I think I would like to group the challenges into 4 broad categories. We have high level of uncertainty in our macro economies around the world. We see government responding very aggressively with their monetary and fiscal policies. We have trade wars between the United States and many other countries. And lastly, we have a host of social and environmental problems. These challenges are going to influence firm strategy in terms of their way to differentiate their product, convince the consumers to pay for their products, in terms of sustaining and managing their supply chain so that they continue to benefit from low-cost production, in terms of fending off competition from large platform players. And in the end, I will give some simple examples from the fashion industry to pull all these together. And let me point out that, please, as Melanie said, raise your questions throughout the talk so we can answer them hopefully at the end of the presentation. So the year of 2020 is truly extraordinary. So at the beginning of the year, the International Monetary Fund projected that the growth for the world in GDP is going to be 3.3%. 3 months later, a positive 3.3% turned to a negative 3%. And another 2 months later, that negative number has become even more negative. And the positive projection to year 2021 has become less positive. Around the world, governments are responding very aggressively. First, through monetary policy. So in the United States, for example, the Fed has been aggressively cutting interest rate to the extent that our interest rate is close to zero, and there's very little room to cut our interest rate even more unless we're courageous enough to venture into the negative interest rate territory. And we are not alone. Central banks around the world, such as the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, are all cutting interest rates aggressively. In terms of fiscal policy, governments in response to the COVID-19 are putting forward massive stimulus packages. The United States put forward $2.3 trillion worth of stimulus package. EU put forward about $750 billion. A host of other countries, including China, Japan, Italy, Brazil, a lot of massive government stimulus packages. Now, the combination of explanatory monetary policy together with a very aggressive fiscal policy is going to result in central banks booking a lot of government debt on their balance sheet, and then governments are taking on a lot of debt. What that means is that the government needs future generations of taxpayers' money to pay back that debt, or they are going to continue to rely on the capital markets to remain interested in government debt. In terms of trade, in 2018, for the first time in quite a few decades, we saw that trade dropped significantly, even though when we have a pretty nice growth in the world economy. And the country of China is pretty much at the center of all the trade wars. We can see from this chart on the left that China has emerged as a major manufacturing powerhouse in many sectors, and that's why we see China as a threat, as a competitor. But please keep in mind that today in the global supply chain, countries are very much interdependent. Many countries' manufacturing sectors are involved in the same global chain as the global chain that involves Chinese manufacturers. So when United States levies a tariff against Chinese exports, other countries that have provided components to China for further processing before China exports those products to the United States are also going to be hurt. Finally, in terms of social and environmental problems, over the last 3 or 4 decades, we first have the positive news that around the globe, we see the number of people who lived under extreme poverty almost halved over that time period. Mostly that improvement comes from East Asia and the Pacific, or to be more specific, China. But on the other hand, if you look inside the country, within almost all developed countries, you see a widening gap between the rich and the poor from 2000 to 2015. In almost every country, you see the rich people are become richer and the poor are become poorer. And that's income. If we look at jobs, these scholars point out that from this time during this time period, if we were to put jobs along a continuous spectrum of skill required, we will see that at the lower end of the segment on the spectrum, we do see promising job growth. And then mostly jobs in this segment are in sectors are not tradable. So for example, restaurants, hair salons, plumbing, construction. And then at the other end of the spectrum, at the high skill level, we see also job growth. These will be jobs for software engineers, IT specialists, management, so on and so forth. But what is alarming is in the middle segment, in the middle skill spectrum, we see job loss, significant job loss. This not only creates inequality in terms of income, it also reduces the level of mobility for people at the bottom of the spectrum to move up the spectrum, to move up the skill level to get finally into the high skill level, because the middle segments, jobs in the middle segments are gone. And the lower chart, this is based on my own research, and this is just another piece of evidence. We study the solar PV industry in California, and also we took data from, at the national level. We know the solar industry has seen tremendous growth over the last few decades, largely due to aggressive government subsidy in the sector. But at least in the United States, when you look at where the job growth is, you will see most of the growth in jobs in solar PV sector is in installation, labor-intensive installation. And then there's some growth in sales and design, which it requires high skill. The jobs that require middle-level skills, which is the manufacturing of the solar panels, haven't seen any growth. Environmentally, because we are now living in a very globalized world, multinational firms start to arbitrage in differences in institutional environment. For example, they start to arbitrage in differences in environmental regulations in different countries. So my own study shows that firms are moving some of their most polluting productions to countries where the environmental regulation is more relaxed. And in a way, U.S. consumerism is contributing to, of course, the exports in China, from China, but it is also contributing to air pollution in many countries, including China. But the story doesn't stop there. After all, we live in a globalized environment. We thought we have solved the domestic pollution problem by shifting some of the polluting productions overseas, but we live in a global environment, like I said, so some of that pollution came back to our Western Shore, to cities like Los Angeles. So what can we do? I promised a framework, right, to analyze the challenge and the implications of these challenges on firm strategy. So we first think about, where does firm value come from? The biggest challenges for firms as far as strategy is concerned is for them to both create and capture value. So if you look at the left bar, at the very top, you have consumers' willingness to pay. So firms need to produce, design products that are satisfactory to consumers, so they're willing to pay. And then at the bottom, firms need to incur cost to produce. So the more firms can encourage consumers to pay, and the lower they can, the lower cost at which they can produce their products, the more value the firm will be able to create. At the same time, the firms will not be able to capture all the value they create because there's competition out there. So firms cannot charge the price fully to be equal to consumers' willingness to pay. If there's other competitors out there who are charging competitive price, then you have the focal firm needs to lower the price. So the firm profit is between the price paid by the consumer and then the firm's production cost. So now we can look at each of the 3 blocks on the right. How do we increase consumers' willingness to pay? Well, I can, differentiate my product. I can improve the perceived quality of my product. So for example, I can, produce products with, in the luxurious brand category. But as we said, with the uncertainty in macro economy, consumers are facing budget constraints. They face a lot of, uncertainty, and then they are reluctant to put, their money on some of the luxurious goods. And that's why you see over the last year, there's either closure or, bankruptcy for many of the famous retail stores. Other ways you can differentiate your product include, producing products of network effects. For example, iPhone. The fact that I have iPhone is because my friends, my family members are using iPhones. So those type of products will hopefully give you some opportunity to increase consumers' willingness to pay. You can also design and produce products that can convince a story to your consumers that your products are offering some environmental and social benefits. Then at the bottom, what are the ways firms can cut cost? For the past few decades, we have been focusing on economy of scale by offshoring production to low-cost countries, by co-locating our production factories with factories of other companies so we can achieve agglomeration. And also by arbitraging, like I said, in institutional differences in terms of labor regulation, environmental regulation. Can we still do that with the uncertainty in the political environment, with the pandemic, with trade wars? Our supply chain is being disrupted. So firms need to adjust their supply chain strategy accordingly. Instead of focusing on low cost and just in case inventory, we now are talking about just in time inventory. We now are talking about just in case, so that our supply chain is resilient to these disruptions. In addition, we really need to improve the transparency in our supply chain so we know what is going on deep in our supply chain, and to be aware of any potential environmental or labor issues. We can also rethink about the structure of our supply chain. Again, on the right is a study that I've done a couple of years ago. In that study, we argued that if the firm wants to remain adaptive, flexible, if they want to compete, if they want to constantly put forward, a huge variety of products, they might have to consider vertical integration so that their suppliers have the same incentive as they do. Finally, we have to think about competition. So here, I think there are 2 types of competition that we need to be aware of. One is the potential climbing by suppliers along the value chain. So suppliers might not be satisfied with just supplying you with components anymore. As they build up their capability, as they learn more and more from you, they might become a little more ambitious and they want to enter your segment. Vertically integrate into your segment. So you need to be aware of those potential competition. Another type of competition is from the giant platform players. So over the last few years, we see huge growth of the major platform players, and then they are expanding into the offline market as well. So at this point, I think I would like to, take a break and then have you reflect on your experience and tell us your opinion. So we're going to ask you two questions. One, from your experience, how much has the supply chain in your industry been disrupted during the last 2 years? And two, in your opinion, has the platform economy helped or hurt the competitiveness of your business? So I think I'm going to stop here so that John can have a chance to launch the poll.
Okay, it looks like the poll is launched. So if everyone will record their answers to both polls, please, and then we'll share the results, and Maggie may have some commentary on that. John is behind the scenes running the poll. John, usually I can see the results as they're coming in, and I can't this time. Is everything working okay with the poll? Ah, there we go. I see it now. All right. Poll results are shared. Maggie, are you able to see those?
Yes, I'm able to see them. So what I see is that for the first question, 28% of participants felt like their supply chain has been disrupted quite a lot. 60% of the participants feel that their supply chain has been somewhat disrupted, and then the lucky 13% didn't feel an impact yet. I think later when we go into the discussion session, I'll be very interested in hearing your stories, both the challenges and your responses so far. For the second question, 42% of the people believe that the platform helped their business. Very good. But 31% felt the platform hurt the competitiveness of their business, and another 30% have not felt impact yet. Very interesting results, and I look forward to discussing your experience when we come to the discussion session. Thank you all for submitting your polls.
I know in a previous session on this webinar series that we had on resilient supply chains, one of the things that was mentioned there is that this pandemic has been different from other economic crises, even global economic crises, because this time more than ever, both the demand side and the supply side of the chain were disrupted. Is that, from your experience, a factor here as well?
Totally. And I think, this is a major disruption to the supply chain. And this also made people think that maybe this movement toward online, is really real. So people are rethinking their supply chain even. And also with all the trade wars that's going on. I think with the previous crisis, usually some parts of the world having a crisis and other parts are still okay. So you can somehow shift your productions, from one country to another gradually. This time around, it's a pretty sudden halt. And then some of the manufacturing powerhouse, the largest manufacturing powerhouse in the world, were the first to stop. And then that's why it's so dramatic. And in this case, some of the major manufacturing powerhouses also turn out to be our major consumers in some products. So indeed, there's disruption on both the demand and the supply side. Yeah.
Thank you. All right.
And even if for people who do not sell to the global market or do not buy from the global market, first they have to face disruption in their domestic supply chain. But also, if any of their competitors is selling overseas or sourcing overseas, because the change in the competitive advantage of their competitors, their own competitive positions are going to be affected, even if they had no exposure to international business. Okay, so can I move on now if there's
Yep, go
okay.
ahead. I'll mute
Right.
my audio and video.
All right, so thank you all for again for your input. So so for in the remaining time, I thought I would just give some very simple example from a fashion industry, maybe everyone an industry that most of people can relate to. So we know in this industry over the last few years, there's quite some closure and the bankruptcy, including some of the very famous brands. So how does this industry respond to, reduction in consumers' willingness to pay, increase in cost of production, and then, the competition from platform players? So I looked, at a few firms, like I went to check what they have done. So you see larger luxurious brands such as Prada moving some of their products online, offering free shipping and a return, right? So they're changing the consumer's shopping experience right now. You can go online. We can also see innovation coming from some smaller companies. Intrupy is a app, basically. It's the world's first authentication service. It provides that service that use artificial intelligence and the machine learning algorithms to let consumers detect the authenticity of luxury and design goods. So, so what is the company doing in terms of, increasing, the value of the firm? Basically, it's increasing consumers' willingness to pay, right? So, sure, we have probably fewer rich people now because of the pandemic, but we still have some rich people, and those people probably want to really differentiate themselves and then really want to invest in true luxurious, authentic brand goods. So this company provides a solution to those consumers. So this is intended to maintain consumers' interest in these luxurious products and therefore maintaining their willingness to pay. On the other hand, we have a company called Rent the Runway. This company the strategy is to accommodate consumers' change in their financial status. So what this company does is that it provides an online service that gives designer, dress, and accessory rentals to interested parties. The company was started in 2009 after the last economic crisis. It was at first a pure e-commerce firm, but later it has ventured into brick and mortar stores in large cities like New York and Los Angeles. So basically, you can rent a set of clothing for 4 to 8 days at 10% of the retail price. You can also pay for a monthly subscription to have, I guess, these clothes sent to you on a regular basis. We also have another company called Mimomi. So with all this business going online, so how are they going to push for their sales? So this company provides augmented reality and again, artificial intelligence and software, mirror software, to transform basically the luxury shopping market. Consumers can see what they would look like if they were put into that particular piece of clothing, or if they were to put on that cosmetics or jewelry. So the company has partnered with tech giants such as IBM, Intel on the one hand, and also luxurious brands such as Louis Vuitton and Neiman Marcus and Estee Lauder on the other hand. And finally, I want to, get your attention to a company called Diamond Foundry. So this company produces man-made diamonds in San Francisco. And then this is really to avoid the resource intensity, hazards, and the environmental concerns that come along with the traditional diamond mining. So all these companies are innovative, both old and new. These companies are very innovative, and then they are really shifting their strategy to meet the challenges in uncertainty in the global environment, uncertainty in their supply chain, and a more demanding consumer group that asks for firms being responsible to the environment and to their workers. And together, firms need to think deeply about their global strategic decisions. So I think I'm going to stop here, and then I'll welcome questions, and we can have some discussions along these topics. So maybe I should stop share. Is that right?
Yeah, sure, Maggie. Go ahead and stop share of your screen, and we will take some questions. So we have several questions coming in, and one of them is kind of one of these sort of overall, maybe somewhat philosophical question, but you have experience in having worked at the IFC and the World Bank, and in industry and consulting auditing as well. So what are your thoughts about, this is a question from Praveen, by the way. What are your thoughts about whether or not we're going to learn adequate lessons from this current pandemic so that we will be better equipped in the future to deal with similar kinds of crises? Or are we doomed to repeat our mistakes?
I think, some of the mistakes, I wouldn't say mistakes. Some of the actions I see, especially in the policy area, I think are somewhat similar to what we have done before. So I wouldn't call them mistakes. These are decisions made under a hugely uncertain environment. So we'll have to wait and see. There are other trends, I think, with every major crisis. When I teach my MBA students, I often ask my students, why do we pay attention to crisis? Crises are never independent events. Crises oftentimes reflect some profound imbalance in our economy, in our society. And then we have been just not paying enough attention until crisis really hit us. So a crisis is an opportunity for us to really pay attention to these problems again, and then to think about a profound shift either in our strategy or in the way we do business, and then to come up with something that's new, our strategy or our business models. And then this time I see a big shift toward online shopping, a big shift toward working from home. So these are changes not only to our strategy, to our business models, but also to our social structure, right? So I don't think these trends are going to go away totally after the pandemic. So some of those trends are definitely going to stay. So I think this is, if you have been thinking about making changes along these lines for a long time, but haven't got the courage or the opportunity to do so, maybe this is the time. Otherwise, you'll be late again for the next crisis.
Yeah, I think, in the executive education learning experience realm, we're seeing that people are getting comfortable quickly with the online learning environment, especially when it's done well and done right and made interactive and so on. We're also still seeing, though, a clamoring for getting back together. So when we're doing our programs, people are commenting on, oh, this actually works pretty well, and so on. And yet there's still many, many comments about, but I can't wait until we can be back together, in the classroom, in the activities that we do. So
yeah, definitely. So last November, I was asked by the school to design the online MBA program, to design an online version of my in-classroom class. It was, tremendous effort. I have to put down a lot. I have to totally change my mentality in thinking about how can students learn asynchronized, learn about these topics which require a lot of discussion and interaction. But now we're thinking, how do we design them to allow students to think on their own in an asynchronized manner? So we've been working hard on that, and the original plan was to launch that program in June, and then COVID never wait, right? You can't wait. So COVID happened, and quickly my in-person teaching has turned into hybrid teaching. Only a third of my students are in classroom, and 2/3 of them are online now. So I really have to, I think in a way my earlier, effort paid off a little bit, because I was able to use some of the digital content I prepared before to show to my online students. So that has been quite rewarding. But on the other hand, we also face challenges. For example, in my class, I play games, right, to simulate the global trading environment, and then that has been quite challenging. Yeah, students have to communicate, online, offline. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge experiential learning opportunity for all of us. So earlier in your talk, you mentioned China, obviously, as a huge player on the economic stage and having lots of impact and influence. So Mohammed is asking this question: are you thinking China is a threat or an opportunity to recovering from economic growth after this COVID-19 pandemic phase? Does the China model help other countries to maintain and recover from economic glitches? So China, threat or opportunity?
Mm-hmm. So I always tell my students, I don't know if there are students in the audience, I always tell my students that the answer to every one of my questions is it depends. So, the way to answer your question is it depends. So in terms of, is China a threat? Does China hurt? It really depends on who are you talking about, right? So, and we're not I'm not just saying, China is going to hurt the US, but it's going to benefit the Chinese. No, it's not that simple. It's who within the United States, who within China, right? So oftentimes we think a country as an enemy, but it's only an enemy to a subgroup of people in that country. There are certainly people who have benefited tremendously from the growth of China. And, if nothing else, consumers have benefited from cheaper Chinese goods. Some of the American firms have benefited a lot from consumers from China. As China grows rich, the middle class is emerging, more and more Chinese are shopping globally. So firms benefit from that. So it really depends. And as for the question whether the China model can be applied to other countries, so again, it depends. So in some aspect, the China model can be applied, but in other cases, it cannot. I think in some of the developing countries, the concern is that do we still have opportunities to do what China used to do? I think China is lucky in the sense that it was at the beginning of this globalization trend. It's benefiting and it's taking dividend, right? There's a term called globalization dividend. China is taking dividend from this. And now we are in a world where countries are already very interdependent. And then for some of the countries, we do worry about premature industrialization. So before these countries can use their cheap labor to engage in global production, like China did at the beginning stage of its development, a lot of the manufacturing is being automized. So we're using robots instead of cheap labor now. So then for countries that have not developed their labor force, they might feel challenged in developing their labor force by taking orders from multinational firms, right? Because some of the jobs will be now performed by robots rather than human labor. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Given your answer to that, I think I know at least what the first part of the answer to this one will be, but this is a question from Chiranjeev. He says, do you think this is the right time for companies to diversify, invest in assets, or take over the allied line of business? What is the implication in ROCE with this strategy? I'm thinking you might draw on your experience as an investment officer at the IFC on this one. Is it, the right time for companies to diversify, invest in assets? What is the implication for ROCE with this strategy?
So I think whether you so again, like Melanie said, it depends. It depends. So if we're talking about investment, what we need to keep in mind is your opportunity cost, right? So I think some of the troubled industries definitely provide good opportunities for investment, would generate a good ROCE. But on the other hand, you really have to think about, the opportunity cost. Does it make more sense for you to focus on your own industry, to upgrade your system, to think about, to reposition yourself, to think about, developing or joining an online platform, or do you want to, divest into another traditional industry? I think the answer, it depends, because it depends on the industry specifics. I think even if you stay within your own industry, we're not saying you will just do what you have done before. You probably have to think about moving up or down the value chain, right? So when you usually in strategy, we talk about horizontal diversification, meaning you go into a different business segment, into a different market. We also talk about vertical integration, right? So you can stay in your main industry, but you think more about your upstream, your downstream, and whether you want to broaden or narrow your scope vertically. I think it's very industry specific, and it critically depends on both your investment opportunities, but also your cost of capital, your opportunity cost.
Okay, very good. Here's a question from Praveen. Should people start designing products keeping supply chain resiliency in view? So as they design, do they keep supply chain resiliency in view? And if yes, do you see cost and environmental factors might become challenging?
Definitely. I do think when people design, they have to think about, the potential huge change in supply chain in mind. Are we going to continue to see a very globalized supply chain, or we're going to see the supply chain becoming more regionalized? Are we still going to focus on low cost economy of scale sole sourcing as we design our supply chain, or we will start to think about diversification, right, of supply chain? Yes, so we do have to keep that in mind. The second question was about the environmental concerns.
Yeah, and I think, Praveen is specifically asking about when you're designing products, are companies going to change the way and the kinds of products that they design because of, new efforts in supply chain resiliency? And then do you see cost and environmental factors becoming more challenging?
Yes, okay. Yeah, so the second part of the question is cost and environmental challenges. So to me, everything is a cost, right? So you have production cost and you have environmental cost. One cost is some cost that firms internalize, so they pay those costs. And then environmental costs, sometimes it's a negative externality. You hope that society will pay for that cost, but now our consumers, our investors, our employees, all kind of stakeholders are demanding that that firms account for some of those environmental costs. So I think a major trade-off between a global supply chain and a regionalized supply chain is cost versus flexibility, right? So if you have a supply chain that's closer to your firm, you will have more timely response, provided you have a solid infrastructure to start with. If you offshore, if you choose a globalized supply chain, there's going to be a lower cost, but the trade-off is that it might be some response time, especially if there's disruption to that supply chain. You might be at a disadvantage. So in terms of production cost, there is a difference in cost when we think about global supply chain and local supply chains. And again, this is conditioned upon that you have both well-established upstream industries in both places. So another challenge firms face is that you want to source locally, but you just don't have the suppliers in place. So that's yet another difference, challenge to think about. In terms of environmental issues, I think, at least for firms in developed countries, if you want to source locally, you will be subject to more stringent environmental regulation. Which might not be a bad thing, actually, because firms always think regulation is bad. I don't really always think so, because if you source from a country where regulation is strong, all firms in that country are subject to strong environmental regulation. So competitively, you might not be at a worse position. So if you so let me just stop at that. Yeah.
Okay. So a very complex situation, and in all dimensions it depends, but using frameworks and your knowledge about your business and your industry, you can make more optimal decisions perhaps, and manage your around opportunity cost and all those other dimensions you mentioned. While we're on the topic of supply chain, I'm going to skip down one question to this question from Jiang. It did impact the global supply chain in many ways. What are your suggestions to supply chain industry professionals to cope with these global challenges?
Right. So I think that many of the firms on the supply chain probably are not single segment firms. In other words, you are probably you're operating in a few segments along the supply chain. So I think the first analysis you want to do is to look at these few segments you are currently engaged in, and then think which segment you want to focus on and which segment you want to let go. I also think in many cases, a supplier also has its own suppliers, right? So it's not just, you have a final firm and all firms are supplying directly to this final firm. Everybody is supplying to somebody else, then supplying to somebody else. So you would, even for a supplier on the supply chain, you would also have your own subset of supply chain to manage. So some of the challenges that are facing the ultimate consumer will be applicable to you as well. So you have to think about how to diversify your subset of supply chains, and then whether and if your customers are diversifying their supply chains, is it time for you to think about diversifying into other countries so that you can supply the same consumer but from different countries?
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Bernardus is asking you to comment on which global industry sector or sectors have experienced more positive impacts from the perspective of the value chain. For example, ICT, information communications technology. With people going online, we're going to need more ICT solutions. What are your thoughts about which global industry sector or sectors have experienced more positive impacts from this situation?
I think industries that are dependent less on the global supply chain, or when they use the global supply chain, they use less of the kind of the physical labor or physical assets. If they're taking advantage more of the people's talent, it doesn't matter that much if the talent is in countries where there's a huge pandemic, right? People can still work from home. And I think those industries will be less hurt. Actually, they might even benefit from the current situation. So, I think, earlier in our poll, some audience members did mention that they benefit from from the situation, right? So I think they can share with us their stories as well. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So in business and management, we often talk about the hard skills and the soft skills. MG is asking your opinion about what soft skills should be considered in this VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world to correctly handle these strategies.
So I think, when we think about soft skills, there are two sets of soft skills I think are critical. One is kind of the managerial thinking, leadership thinking. How do you motivate your employees? How do you tell a convincing story to your client, to your investors, right? Your personality, your charisma. I think that is important. Your ability to build your team and then motivate your team. I think those are very important skills. On the other hand, I also feel like your analytical skills, your ability to see through complex issues, to always get down to the bottom, by looking at this framework of value creation, value appropriation. No matter how different the situation is, if you have enough information, I can then apply that information to my framework. So I've been teaching my course for 12, 15 years. So I have the basic framework, but every year I update my entire course packet to pull in newspaper articles for the last month, right? So the students, I make sure my students in the course packet, they only read articles about what's happening in the world in the last 2 months or even in the current months. But the fundamental framework should not change. So, so your ability to first fully understand the basic framework, and then your ability to handle complexity, right? Because the reality is going to be different from your basic framework. But I might not have as much information as you do about your industry, but as soon as you tell me the story of your industry, I can go ahead, I can search on the internet, I can find enough data, then I can apply the same framework, the fundamental framework. I think that kind of skill is important. It requires constant critical thinking. Always, when someone says something, you always say, oh, well, actually it depends. And then you think, what it really depends on.
Great. All right. Very good. Thank you. Rahul has a question. Now, this is on a specific sector, the energy sector. And if that's not a sector that you are comfortable commenting on in particular, you could perhaps answer more generally. But he's asking, can you share your thoughts on the recovery timeline for the energy sector? And then more specifically, would this pandemic expedite the change in global generation mix towards renewables and new tech, storage and hydrogen?
So yes, you're right. I'm not an expert in this industry, but I think I agree with you. I think the energy sector has faced some challenges even way before the pandemic, right? So we had a collapse in oil price in 2014, 2015, right? With the United States used to have insufficient energy, but starting from the late 90s and the early 2000s, we started the shale revolution. We see huge production from shale gas, and then in 2014, 2015, when we see there's a slight downturn in economic development in emerging markets, when we see Russia and then OPEC countries not being able to reach some agreement to curtail their production, you see a collapse in oil price. And then this time it just happened again, of course, to a larger degree. But I think that trend is going to probably stay for quite some time just because of the surge on the supply side and the reduction on the demand side. So if you think about my framework again, right? So as the economy becomes uncertain, you have a reduction on the demand side that's going to suppress consumers' willingness to pay, even when they don't think about all the environmental problems that are associated with traditional oil and gas mining. And the cost has come down, but it might not come down to you. It come down to the shale gas producers. So maybe it's, your competitors' cost has come down, but your cost hasn't. So that actually just created more problems for traditional oil producers. And then, we have to think about, substitutes, right? So new renewable energies. yes, we do have to worry about that. And then on that, I was just, I gave a talk to, I don't know if I can review this, but I just gave a talk to some executives at a major oil gas company in one of the Asian countries. So there, some of these companies are still state-owned, just vertically integrated. With these new challenges, firms do have to look at their, upstream, midstream, and downstream, and think, do we need to vertically disintegrate? Do we need to become more innovative to accommodate renewable energy? One example I gave is a Norwegian company, I think called Statoil. They had huge offshore operation. It's a traditional oil company, but with the challenge coming from renewables, they now have built massive floating windmills in the ocean, and I find that to be fascinating. You also have major German oil and gas companies like E.ON, which basically did some structural innovation. They separate their business, their traditional business into a new firm, new subsidiary, and then they are just going to focus 100% on renewables. So I think there's a lot of innovation that's required, and so we have to think about renewable as alternative resource and alternative products and service. You can also think about, don't think of yourself as just an oil gas company or energy company. Think of yourself as a service company, right? So energy service company, providing service either to end consumers and to manage their system more efficiently, or to provide service to upstream firms, the oil mining firms, right? So what kind of design, what kind of engineering you can provide for those firms.
All right. Thank you so much. We are out of time, and there are so many other excellent questions here, even some very provocative ones. I wish we had time to answer more of them. We'll send those to you, Maggie, and if there are any that you feel you want to make a written response to or comment on, we'll include that then in the email that we send out to all of our participants. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Maggie, for offering your time to everyone today to help us better understand all of these issues and what we as firms in whatever sector we're in might do to better navigate through this and prepare for future crises as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.